However, today in this lesson, we're going to look at this question of the succession in the church after Joseph Smith's death. Sometimes it's called the succession crisis, which is, in my opinion, a really strong word. I'm not sure I would call it a succession crisis more than the succession confusion. It was a crisis in that the church was at a pivotal time in trying to figure out who should be in charge. And there were a lot of different options, a lot of viable options. But the bigger way to look at it was the succession question. The reason why I don't necessarily call it a crisis is because the majority of the church came to the same conclusion, and that was to sustain Brigham Young and the quorum of the 12 apostles and to follow them. However, that's easy to say in hindsight. The trajectory of history looks inevitable from you and I who stand at our current positions in the present. But if you and I had been in Nauvoo in the summer of 1844, it wouldn't have seemed inevitable. We likely would have had questions and concerns. As I mentioned in a previous video, sometimes people say, why didn't Joseph make it more clear who should lead the church after his death? I personally think Joseph made it very clear. If we had been living in Nauvoo, almost all of us would have known that if Joseph Smith were to die, that the next person who should be president of the church should be not Brigham Young. It should be Hyrum Smith. Hyrum Smith was the co-president or assistant or associate president of the church, who acted according to section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants in concert with Joseph Smith as prophet, seer, and revelator. And so the reason why it became a big question was because on June 27th, 1844, both Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, the president and co-president, were both killed at the same day, on the same time, leading the church to wonder who should be in charge. The questions that were at hand, the options, were many. Should it be one of the counselors in the first presidency? In particular, should it be Sidney Rigdon, who had been Joseph's first counselor for at least 11 years? Should it be another counselor in the first presidency? Should it be, as Emma Smith wanted, William Marks, the Nauvoo stake president, who mainly Emma Smith seemed to want William Marks because William Marks's conservative doctrinal views, in particular his views against and opposing plural marriage, aligned better with Emma's own views. Should it be a Smith child? Should it be familial? In particular, should it be Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III? Or should it be the patriarch of the church, the oldest Smith at the time in the Joseph Smith family, which was Joseph's little brother, William Smith, who also happened to be a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles? William Smith was very erratic, but that was definitely a viable option. Should it be somebody like James Strang, who came rolling in with a supposed letter saying that Joseph Smith had appointed him to be the leader of the church should he die? Maybe it should be another apostle. Just because Brigham was the president of the 12, does that mean he should become president of the church? There's some indications that maybe Willard Richards was trying to kind of vie himself and position himself as the leader of the 12, or that the 12 could have picked somebody else like Parley P. Pratt, who was very popular. All I'm saying is that there were options. We haven't even talked about the Council of 50. Should the Council of 50 make the decision? Who were the council put in charge of trying to lead the kingdom of God as a whole? Well, those are a lot of the questions with the succession. And in this video, we're going to talk about the succession question, these options, what happened. In particular, we're also going to talk about the different restoration branches, different restoration movements and churches that have resulted after Joseph Smith's death, most of them after Joseph Smith's death, so that we can understand them. Then we'll look at the succession, how the succession works in the church today, and the succession to Brigham Young leading the church west. We have a lot to cover in this video, and I hope to do it well. So let's talk about how did Brigham Young then become the rightful successor to Joseph Smith for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a wonderful article I'd invite you to read. It's called 6 Days in August by Ronald Walker. You can just Google it and find it and read it. It's very well written, very comprehensive, and goes into detail. I'm not going to summarize or recite the whole article to you, but a lot of what I'm going to summarize does come from that article here that I'd recommend you go read if you want more details on it. One of the questions, he calls it 6 Days in August because there was this period in the first week of August of 1844 where they really had to settle the succession question. In today's day and age where news comes immediately, remember after Joseph Smith was killed, There was not some immediate news cycle that let everybody know that Joseph had died. And most of the leadership of the church were out on missions. Sidney Rigdon happened to be in Pittsburgh. Joseph had sent him there to build up a branch of the church out in Pittsburgh. And Brigham Young and most of the quorum of the 12 apostles, 8 of them, I believe, were out on missions at the time, helping with the political campaign of Joseph Smith for president. And when he was killed, it took weeks and weeks for the news to catch up. Brigham Young won't even learn that Joseph Smith has been killed until mid-July. And then it takes them a number of weeks to come back home. And so the succession question isn't really attacked and settled until the first week of August, even though Joseph Smith will be killed on June 27th. Well, what goes on? A little bit of what happens is the question of should it really be, originally it came down to, should it be Sidney Rigdon or should it be Brigham Young? Even though there were other viable options. Should it be William Marks and some of these others that I've mentioned, or probably Pratt or Willard Richards or William Smith. They knew that Joseph's son at the time, by the way, couldn't lead the church. He was only 12 or 13 years old. He was just a young boy. Well, when Rigdon hears that Joseph Smith has been killed, he's in Pittsburgh, and he immediately knows that there will be a succession question of who should be in charge. And Rigdon makes no qualms that he feels like he should be in charge. The word that he continually uses is that he should be the guardian of the church. He actually kind of wants to take control immediately, and he invites the apostles who are out east campaigning on their way back to Nauvoo to come to Pittsburgh to hold a meeting with him, almost kind of like controlling, like, I'm in charge, come to my place where I'm at to dictate the affairs. The 12 who are out on missions and here, they are able to communicate with Rigdon and say, no, we're going to go back to Nauvoo, where the body of the saints are, to settle this question, not come meet with you in Pittsburgh. So Sidney hurries and goes from Pittsburgh to Nauvoo as fast as he can. And he arrives in Pittsburgh, from Pittsburgh in Nauvoo before most of the 12 can return. When he gets there, there's only 4 members of the 12 who are in Nauvoo at the time. And they schedule a meeting, these 4 members of the 12, to meet with Sidney Rigdon. And Rigdon doesn't show up to the meeting. The next morning, they're like, let's meet at 8 o'clock. Rigdon doesn't come. Parley P. Pratt goes out in the street to kind of find him, and he sees Rigdon just having random conversations with people and doesn't come to meet with the 12. We don't know why. It just seems that he didn't want to counsel and confer with the 12. And when Parley P. Pratt, who is a good friend with Sidney Rigdon, their days go all the way back before the church was even organized in the Campbellite movement. Rigdon basically says to Pratt, I'm talking to this person, I'll come. But then he ends up going away and says, I'm going to go to this meeting that's happening over here. There was a worship meeting happening at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Rigdon decides he wants to go there. Knowing, by the way, that the people at the meeting would want to hear from Rigdon. It's kind of his way, again, to kind of assert control. And Parley P. Pratt laments and says, we were left to counsel to ourselves, the 4 who were there without Rigdon. At that meeting, the people do want to hear what Rigdon has to say. And remember, Sidney Rigdon's a very eloquent speaker, very powerful speaker. And he has been leading as part of the leadership of the church for a long time. As a matter of fact, some people like to call the 1830s the Sidney Rigdon decade of the church, when he had a lot of influence. His influence began to wane in Nauvoo, however. Joseph did not turn to Sidney Rigdon in Nauvoo to be the leader of the church or the person he counseled with most often. As a matter of fact, Joseph began to distance himself from Sidney Rigdon, even at a time saying that Sidney Rigdon should no longer be in the first presidency and that he didn't want him in the first presidency. Joseph began to lean more and more and more in Nauvoo on the Quorum of the 12, and in particular on Brigham Young. He leaned more on them for not only leadership, but also ordinances, temple ordinances in particular, to receive them and perform them. So there was a gap that had grown between Rigdon and the 12. But when Rigdon showed up, these people wanted to hear what Rigdon had to say. At this meeting, at this 10 o'clock meeting, before the 12 is able to rejoin, Rigdon wants to call for a vote. He wants the saints to make a decision. And there has to be the 12 who are there have to say, no, we're not going to make a vote until all the 12 have returned, or a majority of them, and the 12 can help make the decision of where we should go with the church. We're not having you on your own to do it. But at that meeting, Rigdon speaks and says, quote, that he was the identical man that the ancient prophets had sung about, wrote, and rejoiced over, and that he was sent to do the identical work that had been the theme of all prophets in every preceding generation. He says that he received a vision where he was supposed to be the guardian of the church and build the church up unto Joseph, and that Rigdon said that he held the keys of this dispensation, that he would stand as God to the people, like Moses, and he would preserve the church as Joseph had begun it. That was kind of his claim. And Rigdon had a point, by the way. If you look at section 90 of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 6 and 16, it does say that Rigdon is equal with Joseph Smith in holding the keys of the kingdom. However, Rigdon did not seem to think that Joseph, being dead, released himself or relinquished himself as a counselor to Joseph. He still viewed himself as being in charge or having that authority or being Joseph's spokesman, so to speak, as section 100 said that he should be. After Sidney Rigdon got done, a few other people got up and spoke, and as one person was up in the middle of their talk, William Marks, the Nauvoo Stake president, interrupts them and says that on August 8th, President Rigdon wanted to hold a special meeting of the saints to consider Rigdon's claims. He wanted the succession question settled quickly, seemingly before the Quorum of the 12 could show up as a whole. Rigdon and William Marks had not consulted with the Quorum of the 12 apostles, the existing apostles, to hold that meeting, nor with any of the high council, or even with their own stake presidency. William Marks is the Nauvoo stake president. Well, so in all this, where was Brigham Young? Well, he was still out on his mission out east. He does not learn until July 16th that Joseph is killed, backing up a few days. He was with Orson Pratt. And there's that classic story of when he hears that Joseph Smith has been martyred, just this solemn, somber thing rests on him. And Brigham wonders if the keys of the kingdom have been taken. And he says, I felt, though, as I never felt before. There were no tears, but he says, my head felt as though my head would crack. And in his despair, finally, like a clap, Brigham says, the answer came to him that the keys of the kingdom are right here with the 12. And he brings his hand onto his knee to make the point. In particular, this is because Brigham and the 12 had met with Joseph. As I mentioned in the last video on the martyrdom, in March of 1844, Joseph had held a meeting with the Quorum of the 12 in what some have later called the Last Charge, where Joseph said, I roll the burden and responsibility of leading this church off my shoulders onto yours. Round up your shoulders and stand under it like men, for the Lord is going to let me rest a while. Now, what's interesting is even though this last charge took place with the 12, Joseph didn't identify Brigham as being the successor directly. That was not clear to anybody, but Brigham was the president of the 12 apostles at the time, and therefore the leading, presiding high priest over the 12. Now, one thing that I want to make clear right here, one note of succession, one of the reasons why I do believe Brigham and the 12 had the right to lead the church and not Sidney Rigdon, has not only to do with the keys of the kingdom, but also with the ordinances of the kingdom. Remember, the power of godliness, as section 84 says, is found in the ordinances thereof and the authority to perform them. And Joseph had turned to the 12, and Brigham Young in particular, to perform the highest temple ordinances that had been revealed. It was not Sidney Rigdon who was performing those. It was Brigham Young and the 12. In particular, Brigham Young and others of the 12 had received all the ordinances, all of them, all the temple ordinances. So the question and this maybe wasn't known because those who received the temple ordinances were a small select group, under 100 people, known as the Anointed Quorum. It wasn't necessarily public knowledge yet, but it was Brigham and the 12 who had received and who were giving all these ordinances to this smaller group of people. So in Brigham's mind, the question was not only who has had hands laid on their head, but also who had received all the ordinances and who could give all the ordinances of salvation and exaltation. And to him, the answer was clear. It was not Sidney Rigdon or William Marks or Joseph Smith III. It was the Quorum of the 12 Apostles where those keys rested. Everything that was necessary for the salvation of man is what Brigham recollected. This is the church history topics essay on this subject of succession and the church. Quote, most importantly, Joseph had entrusted a majority of the apostles with all the temple ordinances so that they could administer them to others. They now held not only the keys to build up the church in all the world, but also those associated with the temple, leaving them uniquely positioned to carry on these vital endeavors after Joseph's death. Well, by Thursday, August 8th, the majority of the 12 had finally got back to Nauvoo, including Brigham Young. And they decided to hold a meeting first thing at 8 in the morning to talk about what they want to do to handle this succession question, which is starting to turn into maybe a crisis. What's interesting is Brigham Young is so punctual. He's so responsible. And Brigham Young forgets to show up for their meeting. Now, Brigham will say, I would never do that. And he says, I will not let this go down in the history of the church. People like Anthony Sweat will not tell this in future videos. But Brigham, as people talked about it with him later, says, no. And Brigham goes, oh, maybe I did miss that meeting. As Ronald Walker says in his essay on this, maybe all the stress of the past had caught up to him, but it was a fortuitous forgetting of the meeting that morning. Because instead, he stumbles upon a meeting that is going on with Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon had organized a prayer meeting. And at that meeting, Rigdon was going to call for a vote. He wanted to get the church to vote. And Brigham just happens to roll over there to that meeting. Ronald Walker says, what would have happened? One of those events that would have changed maybe the course of history. Well, when Brigham gets there and he sees what Sidney's doing, he says, quote, I will manage this voting for Elder Rigdon. Brigham says, I didn't even ask for permission to speak. I just showed up when they were getting ready to do it. And I said, I'll manage this. And that must have been a shock to the saints because a lot of the saints in Nauvoo didn't know that Brigham was back in town or that the majority of the 12 were there. So suddenly they wanted to hear from Brigham too. And Brigham says, quote, he does not preside here, meaning Sidney Rigdon. This child, and that means himself, Brigham Young himself, will manage this flock for a season, is what Brigham says. Young complained to Rigdon and those who were there of a hurrying spirit and spoke of the true organization of the church, which required a formal vote by the people in a special seating arrangement, or what we might call a solemn assembly of the church. Anxious to forestall this meeting, Brigham Young says on the spot that they'll hold that meeting at 2 o'clock that same day. They're not going to wait for the coming week as they had planned. So that 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they organize this meeting to finally decide the question that's on so many people's mind. The meeting starts 45 minutes late as they're trying to get everybody together. There's about 6,000 Latter-day Saints there. Sidney Rigdon gets up and tries to preach, but the wind's blowing and boisterous, and his speech isn't very effective. His speech didn't carry the normal power that a Rigdon speech does. And when he sits down, others get up and speak. Also, Elder Amasa Lyman spoke at the meeting. Amasa Lyman had been appointed to take William Law's place in the first presidency. And Amasa Lyman says he wanted the people to know that he didn't feel like he had any special claims just because he was Joseph's counselor. And he kind of aims that at Rigdon, as Ronald Walker says. Lyman's remarks were aimed at Rigdon. And then Walker says this, when it finally came time for Rigdon to defend his claims, he asked Elder W.W. Phelps to speak in his behalf. Rigdon's hour-and-a-half speech that morning had worn him out. The choice of Phelps was a disaster. Phelps stunningly defended the 12, as did the popular Parley P. Pratt a few moments later. After so much confusion and hand-wringing during the past 6 days, the matter ended rather easily. Looking back, the reasons appear clear. There really was no viable alternative to the 12, is how Ronald Walker remembers it. Brigham Young did speak at the meeting. And some people say that Young was all over the place, but the main thing he was doing was he was attacking Sidney Rigdon. He, in essence, says, one report says that Brigham says, who are you counseling? You're Joseph's counselor. And if you want to continue to counsel Joseph, you need to go where Joseph has gone. You're not anybody's counselor anymore. Brigham says, quote, the 12 were appointed by the finger of the Almighty. They were the independent body that, quote, held the keys of the kingdom of the whole world, so help me God. They were the church's new presidency. As Section 107 says, the 12 are equal in authority to the first presidency. Brigham Young also points out and says, taking some aim at Rigdon, had Brigham ever faltered? Had his knees ever been feeble or weak? Pointing that sometimes Sidney Rigdon had. Sidney Rigdon had had some falling out in the Kirtland period, saying that the keys of the kingdom had been lost and rent from Joseph, and Joseph didn't want him in the first presidency, etc. Brigham says that Rigdon had lost his position because of his unfaithfulness. And this is where we get some of these accounts of Brigham being transformed or transfigured. A lot of these accounts do come later, but there are multiple accounts. Brigham remembers himself, quote, "The power of the priesthood sat upon me." And he felt like he could sling mountains as he was speaking at this succession voting meeting. This is how Ronald Walker remembers this, that the Brigham was transformed. He says, quote, "The idea that Young had been transformed or transfigured by the spirit of Joseph Smith became one of the great traditions of Latter-day Saint history. The story has been told many times with many variations. A recent compilation has more than 100 testimonies, 57 of them firsthand, and many written by men and women of ability and reputation. For some, the confirmation had been a feeling or a spiritual witness that they had felt during one of those long meetings on August 8th or in the days that came later. The version often used the word mantle to describe what they had seen, the symbolic cloak of the Old Testament prophet Elijah falling upon his successor Elisha. It was evident to the saints that the mantle of Joseph had fallen upon Young," said Wilford Woodruff less than a year later, "and the road that he pointed out could be seen so plainly," end of quote. Well, speaking of succession in the church, how does succession in the church work? Just a brief primer, if you take a look at these graphics. When the president of the church dies, the first presidency is automatically dissolved now. There is no more first presidency. The first and second counselor are released. They most often are members of the Quorum of the 12, which, by the way, they don't have to be. One thing I want to make clear also is that Sidney Rigdon was never ordained an apostle. He was never part of the apostleship, which we assume that because today most often counselors are almost always apostles. But Sidney Rigdon, William Law, Frederick G. Williams, people like that were not apostles that Joseph called in the first presidency. So when the first presidency dissolves and these apostles retake their seats in seniority in the Quorum of the 12 now becomes the governing body, highest body in the church. And therefore, the president of the Quorum of the 12 apostles is the presiding high priest over the church. And Brigham Young, as the presiding high priest, as the president of the 12 apostles, as I mentioned, led the church for 3 years before they ever reorganized the first presidency. After John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff, they began to reorganize the first presidency immediately. So what usually happens then is that a motion is made that by somebody in the quorum that the president of the 12 should be sustained as the new president of the church. That is then voted on, and then they lay their hands on their head. Usually this is from the church. After a discussion, a formal motion is made and accepted by the Quorum of the 12. If a motion to reorganize the first presidency is passed, the Quorum of the 12 unanimously selects the new president of the church. The new president chooses 2 counselors, and the 3 of them become the new first presidency. Throughout the history of the church, the longest-serving apostle has always become the president of the church when the first presidency has been reorganized. Following the reorganization of the first presidency, the apostle who has served the second longest is sustained as the president of the Quorum of the 12. When the second longest-serving apostle has also been called in the first presidency as counselor, the third longest-serving apostle becomes acting president of the 12, which is what we have currently in the church with Russell M. Nelson as president, Dallin H. Oaks, who is technically the president of the 12 in the first presidency, and therefore M. Russell Ballard is the acting president of the Quorum of the 12. The president of the Quorum of the 12, along with the rest of the apostles, sets apart the new president of the church through a formal laying on of hands. And that is how the new president is chosen. I love that idea because, in essence, it's saying that the way we get a new president of the church is, number one, through life and death, through who serves within the Quorum of the 12 as the longest tenured apostle, when they become the senior apostle through years of service and therefore the president of the 12. There's no electioneering, there's no campaigning that way. It's the president of the 12 who becomes the next president of the church. It's orderly, it's beautiful, it's simple, and it puts people in the church to lead the church now who have years and years and years of experience with it.